we've covered a lot of these kinds of cases, probably most notably with Steven Donziger, who's a dear friend of the show and dear friend. It seems so long ago since the Dakota Access Pipeline protest at Standing Rock. I was there, and it feels like there was never any sort of resolution afterwards. Things just started to escalate under Trump. But you may recall that there were many climate activists who were arrested, and where those stories went, never really was covered in the media. Well, Jessica Reznicek is part of the Catholic worker movement and a climate activist from Iowa. On June 29th, 2021, she was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years probation and a restitution of $3 million paid for a series of attacks on DAPL. She was designated a domestic terrorist. Well, we have her attorney, Bill Quigley, who's a professor emeritus teaching at Loyola Law in New Orleans, and Alex Cohen, an old friend of mine from working Puerto Rico. There's just so much intersectional stuff here. Climate justice organizer and friend of Jessica's, and a member of the campaign to free Jessica Reznicek. Hey, everyone. How you doing?
Great. Thank you for having us.
Hi. Good to see you.
Hey, Alex. So let's sort of just give context to what happened. I mean, I think most of our audience remembers Standing Rock and what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. But I don't know, maybe let's start with Alex as an activist. Remind folks what happened in the fall of 2016, and then after Trump got elected, then what?
Yeah, so we saw an unprecedented mobilization of direct action against a 4-state-long pipeline, largely led by the indigenous community up at Standing Rock in North Dakota. But people also fought in all 4 states that the pipeline crossed through. And Jessica, who we're talking about here, Jessica Reznicek, she was actually from Iowa. And so she went and ran with the Lakota youth, which kind of started this mobilization against the pipeline from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. to try and get Obama to cancel the pipeline. Obviously, Obama didn't. And so then they called for people to come to North Dakota and Standing Rock. And that's where Jessica went. And she kind of realized, hey, a pipeline's going through a majority of my home state, Iowa. I'm going to go home and fight this here. And that's where she did. You can see in this picture here, she set up in front of where they were drilling underneath the Mississippi River. She was by herself in the middle of the night. She set up tires and blockaded the road and said, I'm not leaving. And the police came, arrested her. She got out 24 hours later, and she did it again. They arrested her, and she got out 24 hours later, and she said, where can I stand without being arrested? And they pointed to the ditch. And so she set up camp and asked people to join her, and eventually hundreds of people would come and join her and be a part of this, direct action campaign in Iowa to protect the Mississippi River.
Bill, she kept getting arrested. When they arrested her in the beginning, what were the reasons?
So thanks again for having us on here, and I appreciate it. Jessica and her partner in the action, Ruby Montoya, announced that they had engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience and property destruction trying to stop the pipeline. They did that in front of the Iowa Public Utilities Board. You can see on the screen there, they announced what they had done, and they started taking the letters off of the Public Utilities Board. They were arrested and brought to jail, and they were released shortly after, and waited a couple of years before the federal government finally prosecuted them for a series of actions against the pipeline itself. They taught themselves how to use an acetylene torch, and they went and found empty parts of the pipeline, cut holes in the pipeline, and then they also found equipment that was going to be used to dig the pipeline and to put that in the ground and destroy the property. And they destroyed that property themselves. And they did that over a series of months in places in Iowa, and then ultimately announced that they had done it and announced that they were activated by the Standing Rock activities, and that they stood in solidarity with their sisters and brothers all across the nation who were trying to stop the pipelines from destroying our Earth. And so the federal government ended up charging them with 9 major felonies each, and for all the various places where they had done damage, most of which they had admitted to, both in front of the Iowa Public Service Commission and on libraries and gatherings around, and sometimes on the media as well. And they originally thought that they might try to put the government on trial in their trial, but they were facing what probably was more than 100 years in prison if they were found guilty of the activities that they were accused of. They had admitted to a lot of that already. So Jessica and Ruby both pled guilty to one of the counts, and they were looking at probably 3 or 4 years in prison because there was quite a bit of damage that was done. But at her sentencing, Jessica read a statement explaining how she had always been close to the earth. She'd had a hard time growing up, and that the outside and the rivers and the wildlife had really been part of her family and part of her friendship circle. And then the federal judge announced that, well, she thought that given the amount of damage that had been done, probably it was a sentence in the range of 3 or 4 years. But she went on to say that I have decided that you were engaged in terrorism activity. And so therefore I am going to enhance your sentence, essentially doubling it to 8 years, because she, in the words of the court, threatened the government, and she did this to force the government to act. And Jessica Reznicek, has engaged in civil disobedience before, has engaged in actions that, damage property, never damaging a person, never putting an individual at risk. But this is just an outrageous miscarriage of justice. And we're fortunate that we got a very excellent, experienced federal public defender out of Minnesota to handle the appeal itself. The appeal is coming up. It's originally scheduled in May, maybe a little bit later than that, asking the court to say, look, terrorism, we understand what terrorism is. Terrorism is Timothy McVeigh. Terrorism is ISIS. Terrorism is 9/11, those sorts of things. But nonviolent civil disobedience, where the only thing that damages property, is not terrorism. And if it is, then that is a very ugly and very powerful tool that the government can use against thousands of people in this country who choose to trespass, who choose to do graffiti, who choose lots of things to do. And so that is the sort of the legal struggle that's going on. At this point, Jessica is in prison. She's in the Bureau of Prisons right now and has begun to serve her sentence. Her co-defendant is still awaiting sentencing.
It's interesting because it does set a precedent. I mean, I'm so glad you clarified terrorism, because, she was not her goal, and she did not, regardless, I mean, goal or not, like, there was no violence against any human. The footage we saw is taking letters off of a sign, for those who are listening on podcast right now, and also, what kind of precedent does this create for free speech and freedom to organize, and basically the most basic tenets of whatever's left of our democracy? It says quite a bit. I mean, Alex, as an organizer who knows her, what she did, was this unusual? Was this part of just the typical organizing you guys have been doing over the years? Same tactics?
It was different in the sense that it was, in terms of the Standing Rock movement, that it directly targeted to damage the pipeline, but it wasn't necessarily different from the rage we saw, the righteous rage we saw from the George Floyd protests this past summer. It seems like as conditions tend to get worse, there's an an escalation from people. And so in comparison to the climate crisis and the doubling down on fossil fuels, Jessica did something extremely reasonable, and she didn't harm anyone in the process, nor did she threaten to harm anyone in the process. And I think another thing that's important is that in terms of, the climate justice movement hasn't harmed any individuals in their actions. But what happened to Jessica and the terrorism enhancement didn't happen in a silo. It followed basically state legislators passing critical infrastructure laws after the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And those laws increased criminal penalties for people that simply trespass, making trespass on a pipeline easement just to stage a sit-in or something like that, as a felony. And so dozens of states have passed these laws, and the use of the terrorism enhancement is not something that, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's not something a judge can do on their own. The Department of Justice has to ask a judge to do it, and then a judge can agree to do it. And so in this case, it didn't just happen because the judge thought it, and the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions at the time, didn't just do it because he wanted to do it. He did it because 80 Republicans and 4 Democrats, who are all funded by the fossil fuel industry, wrote a letter in 2017, a public letter, and they asked Jeff Sessions to prosecute not just Jessica Reznicek and Ruby, but also the valve turners, the elderly valve turners who did stuff against the Keystone Pipeline, also from the Catholic worker tradition, asked all of them to be prosecuted as domestic terrorists. And since the valve turners were state charges and not federals, the department, Jeff Sessions didn't. But because Jessica was in the federal court, then Jeff Sessions answered to the interest of the fossil fuel industry and these Republicans and 4 Democrats who represent them, and went ahead and pursued the terrorism enhancement.
So now that it's Merrick Garland, who you guys can't see me rolling my eyes on podcast, but who's just been so courageous in reversing so many Jeff Sessions' positions. But it is the Biden administration, and there is a public conversation about being less reliant on oil, mainly because of our escalation with Russia at this point. But okay, let's take that at face value. Is there a place where Merrick Garland could intervene? Is there a place for activists to apply pressure? I mean, she's not from like let's use Stephen Donziger, for instance. His story, he was sitting in New York courts, and it is so egregious because it's like it flies in the face of everything, But in a right-wing government, you see, okay, I can understand how they get away with it because the institutions support right-wing policies and state legislatures are backing it up. But, now that we have a Democratic president, is there something that can be done? Go to Bill for them.
So in terms of the legal process, the Department of Justice can always change their mind. So they have the ability to pull down the enhancement that they had asked for. They'd have to ask for permission from the court, but they can do that. They as Alex pointed out, they advocated very strongly for this terrorism enhancement. Yeah. The other thing is that they can make the conditions under which she's imprisoned not reflect the fact that she's categorized as a terrorist. And then the president himself obviously has the power of the office to shorten anybody's sentence, to pardon anybody that he chooses to, and that's unreviewable by any courts or by the Congress itself. So there are plenty of things that the federal government can do to back off and back away from what they have done in this case. I think it's important to recognize that I've heard people say, well, look, maybe they did millions of dollars worth of damage. They have to be punished. Well, they're not saying don't punish us. They're saying, punish us according to the way that nonviolent property damage is done. She was never accused of being a terrorist. She didn't plead guilty to being a terrorist. The whole idea of terrorism came after the fact that she pled guilty to the damages, and then the federal government, and with the assistance of the court, went ahead and said, no, we are going to say that what you were engaged in was domestic terrorism. And I think that has a hard time passing the laugh test. But in courts, as you know, lots of things that seem crazy on the outside are taken very, very seriously on the inside. Another point that I'd like to make is, this country was founded on nonviolent property damage and civil disobedience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Boston Tea Party, the act of Declaration of Independence itself was not always nonviolent. It was certainly civil disobedience and breaking the law. And throughout our history, the nonviolent civil disobedience has been a part of every transition and every social justice campaign. It's not the only part. It's an important part. Legislative part is important. Media, organizing, door to door, all these things are important. But we ought to recognize this as part of the process of change.
Oh, I think we just lost Bill. Well, go ahead, Alex. Why don't you pick up from there? We'll wait for Bill to reconnect. Yep. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and also to your question earlier, I think and to what Bill was saying is, I think it's important to remember that Jessica came out of the Catholic worker tradition, and in that sense, the Plowshares movement in this tradition of nonviolent property destruction, Jessica's actions do fall in line with that tradition that she was kind of acting in. And one thing the Catholic workers have always done is owned up to what they did, and that's exactly what Jessica did. And she was ready to take responsibility for the consequences. And just like Bill said, she's not trying to get necessarily no time at all. She is just trying to overturn this terrorism enhancement, and that is kind of what the petition that we made with Jessica before she went into prison, that over 100 organizations have signed now, including 350.org, Rainforest Action Network, Sunrise Movement, people from the peace movement like Code Pink and Veterans for Peace. I mean, really a broad-based coalition of people have said, hey, look, whether or not we agree with what Jessica did, whether or not we even think it was violent or non-violent is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the fact that Jessica is not a terrorist. And if she is a terrorist, then many of us are, lined up to be next by the federal government to be called terrorist based on the things they used in the federal court to designate her as one.
Yeah, and I would point out one other thing too is that this terrorism enhancement is openly being discussed against Black Lives Matter protests, openly being discussed against other sorts of animal rights protests, of lots of things, as a clear effort to intimidate protesters, a clear effort to hyper-criminalize the activities that people are willing to engage in. As part of this is that, as Alex was referring to earlier, the state of Louisiana changed its law from trespass, a misdemeanor, to a felony if you trespass anywhere around a pipeline. And they arrested 15 people on the extension of the Dakota Access Pipeline through Louisiana, which was called the Bayou Bridge Pipeline at that point. And it took 3 years to be able to clear those felonies off of those folks. And they're suing the federal government now to try to invalidate the law itself, because it serves no useful purpose. And the other point about this is that politically, the DAPL pipeline people are joined at the hip with the Trump administration and have used the same lawyers that he used, although these days Trump has used so many lawyers that, sort of not a thing of distinction anymore to share a client with Donald Trump. But and the head of the pipeline company made a public address that was carried in the Wall Street Journal saying that these two women ought to be removed from the gene pool.
Unbelievable.
For daring to try to slow down and stop the literal rape of the earth and the destruction of our water and our species and the like. And it's just like they are the people who are doing us a favor by destroying our environment and continuing the pillaging and that. And it's a horrendous thing. And Jessica, fortunately, is a very peaceful person, but she's a person of high principle, and she stood up for her principles time and time again. And she doesn't regret what she's done. And she told the judge that she said that she wouldn't do it again. And she's in prison. She would rather not be in prison for 8 years but she's doing the best that she can and standing up, inspiring all of us.
On screen, there was a note from Jessica and just what she's going through right now. Alex, where is she? What's the condition like? How is she feeling? Have you been in touch?
Yeah, so she's in Waseca, Minnesota, in the federal prison there. It's still a prison, but luckily it's not a high security prison. That's another thing that this terrorism designation can do, is that it can change your, not just your sentence length, but also where the Bureau of Prisons places you, and whether that's in a supermax, a high security facility with very little time out. So luckily Jessica's not in there right now. She's in a low security, but it's still prison. COVID has been extremely hard. Right. I know she said recently she resonated a lot with a piece she read from Leonard Peltier, who's been in prison for decades now, who said out of, all his decades in prison under COVID has been the hardest. So even as things are opening back up on the outside, on the inside, there's still an extreme isolation, not getting out, not being allowed to go outside, and things like that has made it really tough. And so she's hoping that starts to lift soon, some of those COVID restrictions.
All right. So is there anything folks can do? I mean, we're fighting a legal system that is, really changing the rules midway, but what can folks do? I mean, there's a petition, as you mentioned. Bill, do you have any advice? Alex, just chime in. Feel free to share.
Yeah, the first thing is to sign up at the petition. That way you'll be able to stay in touch with what the developments are. I think at this point that Jessica's asking that we go forward with the appeal and try to do what the courts will allow. And if the courts can address this, then all fine and good. We'll come back for resentencing. If the courts can't address this, then we will go ahead and ask the president, and we'll have a campaign to ask the president to be able to pardon her or to cut her sentence in half. And even then, it's not just, and she would be the first to say it, it's not just about Jessica. It is about fighting this for Black Lives Matter, for Indigenous people, for other people who are protesting, so that we retain the right to be able to stand up and gain attention to the injustices that are cascading over us in the United States. So it's tough. It's really tough, but on the website they have her mailing address. You can send her a card in prison. That always helps people in prison. But what we need to do is to change the system. We need to use this campaign to change the system so that it doesn't create other Jessicas, and does something to try to help all the people who are fighting against not just climate injustice, but racial injustice, police injustice, all the various things, campaigns that we're fighting across the country.
Yeah, and just everything Bill said, and just to add that, from a climate justice organizing perspective, and like many news organizations have been put out, like many of us in the movement are watching this as a test as to whether or not water protectors in the US will be officially designated as terrorists. And so, like Bill said, it's much bigger than Jessica. Jessica sees it that way as well. Before she went into prison, after her sentencing, luckily she was allowed to self-report months later. So we were able to kind of make this petition together. She was, able to talk with different organizations before she went in and start making these connections. Coming up next week, actually, on Tuesday, we're having a webinar. And this webinar is going to try and highlight this connection, right, from Donziger to the critical infrastructure bills to the terrorism enhancement being used, and people can register for that webinar
where is it?
On our social media, which is like at Free Jess Rez, FREEJESSREZ, and people can register there. And that's going to be the best way to get involved. Yeah, that and signing the petition. If you're an organization, please sign on to her petition as well and send it out to your networks. We are definitely growing. And I know it's from Donziger and these critical infrastructure laws, and my friend or your friend, or seeing yourself in Jessica being called a terrorist, it can seem like a lot, but And it is a lot, and it is sad, and it is scary, but I really do have hope for her appeal, because I feel like in an unprecedented way, people are making these connections, and large, big green orgs are showing up and saying, you know what, what's happening, Jessica, is not okay and could even happen to us. And these are people who don't even engage in any type of direct action. And so that does give me hope.
And there are other organizations who have joined in amicus briefs, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Water Protectors Legal Front, the Center for Climate Disobedience, and many other groups that recognize that this is not just an injustice to her, but it is a threat to all of us who are willing to put ourselves on the line and put our future and our time on the line. Alex was arrested himself in Louisiana as part of this thing, and so are many other people. So this could be, any one of us at any time, and we need to encourage and support the people who are courageous enough and whose life is such that they can take these actions, and support Jessica, but to support all of these campaigns that people are fighting.
100%, and it's and it's a she's part of faith-based organization, and that's also another element to this where we often the right wing tries to own faith-based organizations, but there is so much part of the peace movement, nonviolent protest that is rooted in that. So, all right, well, folks know where to go. Please keep us keep in touch with us about what's happening, what we can do. This is just, it's tragic. We hope she stays safe, especially given, COVID rates spiking once again. And please reach out to us in any way just to keep us informed about her case.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
so much.